Welcome to Leadership Language. We've created this podcast series to bring you inspiring conversations with a broad range of leaders about the power of communication. We talk candidly to our guests about leadership styles, success, moments of learning, the uncomfortable situations, and courageous conversations that follow. Importantly, we discuss self-awareness and how vital it is for our future success. This week, our Managing Director, Sheena Ireland, speaks with Clare Gunning, Head of Government Relations and Partnerships at the Business Council of Australia. Grab a cuppa, sit back and learn more about the leadership language of Clare Gunning.
Hi Claire, welcome to the Leadership Language podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. You're a leader that I have witnessed and admired for a very long time. You're a communications expert and you're currently working at the Business Council of Australia and had such an esteemed career. Claire, as a leader, how would you describe your style?
I think that on my best days, my leadership style is, challenging and a drive for results, and also a really sort of warm and curious interest in being curious about people and what we're trying to achieve. And on my bad days, I have a hashtag trainwreck, which describes those days where it's all kind of coming off the rails. But I suppose what I've tried to do over time is really focus on being authentic and owning both the good days and the bad days, and hopefully catching myself if I'm having a bad day and I'm particularly strung out and I can get quite hypo and energized and over the top, maybe some would say quite an anxious energy at that point, and being able to just sort of like catch it and think, all right, hashtag trainwreck, having a bit of a trainwreck day, how do we get it back on track? Have a bit of a joke about it with my staff, have a bit of a laugh, and then sort of sort out how to get back to my best leadership space, which is really more about that warm curiosity and creating a good space for people to do their best work.
Claire, something I love about you is how you own both of those sides. Not a lot of leaders will go out there and tell you the good and the bad sides. And from what I'm hearing there, communication fits in really well, both with yourself and with others on those good and those train wreck days as well. How do you say communication fits in there?
I think there's a lot of pressure on us, particularly if you're a professional communicator, to be good at communicating in a leadership context. So people think, well, if you're all day thinking about how to position an organisation or what the key messages should be around a particularly prickly issue, then you should also be really good at your own personal communication with your people, with your stakeholders. And what's really fascinating to me is that I know for myself, I can be really on point with my professional communications, and I can just forget to tell people critical information about where I might be during the day, or pass things through properly from one stakeholder to another, or from a senior person to my team. And so I've had to work really hard on honing both sides of that communication sphere, I suppose. But also, I think that it's really important to be kind to yourself as well, and to know that no one's perfect and you have your good and your bad days, and you need to identify your areas that you're not naturally strong in and work on them, but also just own them a little bit too, because there's lessons and power in understanding what your shadow side is and working with it, not against it, and not railing against the things that you aren't as good at, and actually embracing those.
That's such an insightful look at that, Claire. And I love that you mentioned there kind of the learnings around leadership. And I think leadership is a constant learning lesson. We never hit peak leadership at any point. Is there a key moment in your leadership career that you think has helped shape both your leadership and your focus on communication?
Yeah, I think that it might not have been a moment, but there was definitely a period. I started off being a leader as an EL1, or a sort of a mid-range executive in the public sector, and I had a small team of about 3 people. And it was the first time that, at the time I didn't know it, but what I started displaying was really an aversion to having hard conversations and a real desire to please people and make people happy. And those two things combined when you're leading people meant that I wasn't really being fair to my team, because I wasn't really giving them honest feedback. I wasn't talking about anything that was slightly difficult. And my main way of operating was just to sort of make everything okay. But as you know, if you have an elephant in the room and you're pretending everything's fine, in fact, that can make it worse. So from that period, I was really lucky, and I landed in a talent program, and that was where I got coached, and I developed some self-awareness and understood things like, I don't like having hard conversations. Okay, so how could we practice that? And also, why is that even important? Like, why should you bother being courageous? And in the end, what I've come to learn, and I've seen it happen for myself so many times and for others, is where leaders step up and have courageous conversations, where they're brave in the way they communicate. And with love, I don't mean just saying whatever comes to your head. I mean with absolute love and compassion, having real conversations and being really courageous in the way you lead. It is of huge service to the people that you lead, because they, for the first time maybe, are going to get real insight into what's required of them, what the expectation are. They feel a sense of safety, because they know that you'll, with holding their best interests at heart, you'll have real conversations with them, and it actually helps them go from strength to strength. And people who I've worked with who on first glance might have seemed like they were really off the mark in terms of the work they were doing or their behaviours in the workplace, with not very many actually, but fairly courageous conversations, have seen them grow as humans and become like amazing people at work and people anyone would want in their team. So for me, that period of the first time I had a small team, realising and having some self-awareness about my own shadow side, I suppose you could say, my own challenges around leadership, and then being brave, leaning into that, working on that period in my life was just changed the way I led forever. And now I think about that often when I have those same feelings, like I still have them, where I'm reluctant to really engage in a courageous conversation.
Yeah, that's so wise, Claire. And I think self-awareness is one of the most important elements of communication and leadership. And like you said, you had that experience where you're able to get that insight working with a coach, which I think is also quite an important thing. When we can get that self-awareness, it just makes us even better at what we do. And those courageous communication, or courageous conversations rather, is something that's under the spotlight at the moment. You know, leadership is under the microscope at the moment. Communication is under the microscope. And it seems that people who are willing to have that courageous conversation are actually sort of succeeding at the moment, whereas others who are getting defensive and blocking those communication are finding they're struggling. What's some advice you would give to some people about how they can gain that self-awareness to really understand their own communication style?
Yeah, well, look, I think that the first thing I'd say is reflect on, do you know your own strengths and your areas for development? And if you don't, then the first thing to do would be explore those. So it's hard to ask people for constructive feedback. Most people are quite reluctant to provide that, but most people will be very happy to tell you your strengths. So the first thing I do is really identify what your strengths are. Good people to ask are your managers, your stakeholders, your staff, if you have a certain level of trust where you feel they'll be quite honest with you, and then people in your private life. But particularly anyone you know who already is a leader, they're normally fairly attuned to other people's strengths and areas of development. So I'd ask particularly on your strengths, because you'll probably get more honest answers for that. And then one easy way to kind of start on that self-awareness journey is to think about what you're good at, and think about the times where you either overuse that or think about the flip of that strength. And those two things are the other side to your strength, or an overused strength might be areas where you have a bit of a shadow side, or you have some qualities that you need to be a bit aware of, because they can have unintended impacts on others. So just a really easy example for me is I'm really extroverted. I'm really happy to talk in a meeting or in a large crowd. But when I overuse that strength, it means I might not be creating space for other people, might not be listening really well, I might be dominating or not allowing the no in the room to come forward. So if I overplay my natural extroversion qualities, then, I'm not creating space for others. So for my piece of awareness around that is to just pay attention to when that's happening. And then where I can, be quite intentional about thinking, all right, I've had a good say here. I'm going to wait and listen to what others have to say. I'm not going to just listen thinking, what will I say next? What's my next killer point? I'm actually just going to listen. And that's one example of a strength of mine that I know. And then the kind of working with the shadow side of that, which I think everyone can probably relate to some strength they have and where they overuse that.
That's a really, really great point, and really good self-awareness. And too often we can be led to believe that, when we've got a strength, we need to overuse that and we need to overplay that. And something we also talk a lot about at Specialists in Communications is that there's no bad communication behavior styles. So we can be led to think that, you know, your behavioral style with being extroverted is like the perfect person for a leader. And, you know, you are an amazing leader. It doesn't mean someone who is introverted does not make a great leader. They have other strengths and they have other shadow sides that they can work on and things like that. So I think it's a really valuable lesson, and that's such an amazing example there to go, yes, there is a strength there, and yes, it is part of your leadership and you use it well, but it also highlights where you might have areas you consciously have to work on, like that stopping, the listening, etc. And really, you know, once you do that, the self-awareness, helping fill that void or helping be aware of it can help you just be a better leader every day.
And I think along those lines as well, the best leaders I've worked with are people who can kind of, if not sort of manifest all those different experiences. So they're people who might have a natural inclination to be introverted, but when needed can stand up and do a presentation, or people who are naturally extroverted, but when needed can sit quietly and listen and think. And so if you're able to actually be really intentional about what aspects of your leadership style you're using, so, you know, what is my purpose and role in this meeting or in this moment? Is it to lead the conversation? Is it to be up the front? Or is it to sit back and listen, as just a basic example? If you can be intentional, then you have choice. You know, if you understand yourself, then you choose when to use your strength. You choose when to try the opposite to that. You can choose when to dial something up or dial something down, depending on the environment. You know, it's not happening to you. You're really in control of the space and the environment that you create. So exactly, I mean, whatever leadership style you naturally have, you can round it out and be an amazing leader from wherever you start, as long as you're quite motivated to be aware of who you are and how what you do matters.
Really amazing points there. Something you just said leads really well into our next question, which is the not necessarily taking it personally. And you've worked in key leadership positions for a long time now, including being a key spokesperson for big agencies. And it means that what you say can be under a lot of scrutiny from both inside and outside your organisation. You know, how do you maintain a focus on good communications when sometimes, let's be honest, it can feel like people want to twist the message for their own agenda?
Yeah, so look, the first thing I'd say about this, and I have to think about this all the time, is not everyone thinks the same as you or me or any other person. We all come to every situation with our own worldview, our own preconceptions, our own ideas. And so, often I find when I work with professionals and I'm helping them in their communication, they feel a sense of frustration because to them, you know, something is really obvious. Like, shouldn't everyone understand that X is true? But the reality is everyone doesn't even know X exists, let alone that it's the best thing that's ever happened, or that, you know what I mean? Like, every positioning that you're trying to take can change rapidly depending on people's worldview. The first thing is to know that, to reflect on how much you're letting your own assumptions and beliefs shape your message, and then to be conscious and cognizant. I was actually reading a book the other day. Christopher Pine put out his book, and he talked about when he was in his political life, he always thought about Bob and Nancy Stringbag, who were imaginary people who probably lived in sort of the outer suburbs and, you know, working class kind of people. Very different to Christopher Pine, right? They're not political class, they're not elites and all that kind of thing. And he would think about them when he was thinking about how to frame a message or how to talk to people. So you have to have your own version of that, where you think about other people's worldviews and you reflect on what you're saying and how they might interpret it, not just how you mean it. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is you have to really be conscious about the difference between your intention and your impact. So what I mean by that is we often judge others by their actions or their impact. So if you said something that upset me, I'd say, well, Sheena upset me because she said whatever, but we judge ourselves by our intention. So if I said something that upset you, I'd say to myself, well, that's okay, it wasn't my fault because I didn't mean it. I meant a nice thing, right? So it's like I'm judging myself on my intention, but I judge you on the impact. So one quick trick is to try and flip that. So think about what you're saying or how you're communicating or how you're leading. Think about what is the potential impact, not your intention. Your intention hopefully is good, but what are the potential impacts? And then work with that. So work the message around the impact, not so much the intention.
I think that's an amazing way to put it, Claire, particularly at a time when the world is feeling fear. And so even more real to what you're saying now, and especially as leaders who are exhausted, who have been working hard, who have their own fear. in life around what's going on at the moment with the coronavirus, looking at that intention and impact is really important, because we can get defensive. We can think that others, again, that world of fear perpetuates that cycle of thinking others are intending to do wrong. Rather, like you said, when you flip it, the intention could be good, because when we do that, we go, oh, I didn't intend that. So I think that's it's a great and powerful example, Claire, particularly at a time when we are seeing a lot more of that happen, a lot more of those assumptions happen, because people are somewhat afraid.
Yeah, and I think to whatever extent you can, as maybe not as someone who's communicating, but as someone who might be listening, or as someone as part of your community, it's helpful to get into a habit of assuming good intent. So assume that people are coming with good intentions to whatever the situation is, and I'd include the current situation in that. So no leader, whether they're a leader of an organisation, a party, or in a community group, is right now grappling with the issue of coronavirus or bushfires or whatever the latest crisis is with a negative intention, right? Their intentions are pure. They want to help. They want to do the right thing. Now, sometimes they might not make the right decision, or they might stumble in the way they communicate, or their messaging might not be perfect and it might upset people. And that's completely valid as well, those experiences. But to whatever extent we can, if we can assume that people come to any given situation with positive intention, it really helps you in your listening as well as your communicating.
It's so powerful, and you're absolutely right. No one is intending to do wrong. It's just decisions that are being made at that point in time with the information that's known. So I think that's a really important one. It leads us to a really good question, which is, it looks at what your advice you would give to the next generation of leaders coming up the ladder.
Well, I think it's an extension of what we talked about, which is, first of all, know yourself, really understand who you are, what your natural tendencies are. And if you're someone like me and you're a natural people pleaser, or you naturally don't like conflict, then think about what the purpose is of sometimes saying no, or the purpose is of sometimes having a hard conversation, and work on those skills and take baby steps to do that. But really think about what you need to do to develop as a leader and work on that. And the second thing I'd say is, now more than ever, I know it can feel like things are happening to you, like you're not completely in control of your life. And especially if you might be experiencing a prolonged lockdown, or there's rules and there's restrictions on you that certainly aren't of your choosing. Try and look for the opportunities that you do have to have choice and be in control of your life. Because if there's one thing I see crop up in people, whether they of any age, to be honest, but sometimes a bit of a victim mentality can sneak into people's consciousness. So they sort of start thinking that it's not fair, it's all happening to me, I'm kind of a passive player in this stage and I'm just being pushed around by life. I'm not saying that's not true. In some ways that is true, but there are ways that you can make choices. There are things that you can do to take control of your life. And especially if you're young and you're starting out, take the bull by the horns. This is your life. You've only got one. So make the most of it.
Amazing advice there, Claire. And everything you said today is tied into that self-awareness. It's removing assumption, which you and I have talked about a lot, getting curious instead of judging, and really being fully aware of yourself and what you want to achieve, and testing those assumptions, even testing the assumptions of your own thought process. So broadening your mind towards that. Such great advice today, Claire. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I mean, I think it's a great thing to just reflect all the time on how you're communicating and how you're leading. And if you ever do need any further ideas or help, there's heaps of stuff out there. I'm sure, Sheena, you'll have way more interesting guests on the podcast who can help as well. But yeah, it's a really good thing to continue to think about. And as you said when we started, it's not something it's not a destination you never really arrive. You're just constantly working at it.
It's so true. Thank you, Claire, and have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thanks for joining us for our Leadership Language podcast. We hope you've been inspired by Claire's story and perhaps gained some new ideas on how to refine and improve your own leadership style. We'd love you to tune in next fortnight when we'll speak to Professor Aidan Byrne, Provost at the University of Queensland. Until then,